Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our mini-symposium on health and relationships. I'm Ozlem Ayduk from the University of California, Berkeley, and I will be moderating this session. The mini-symposium is being sponsored by the Sabancı University, so I want to start out by thanking Dr. Yusuf Leblebici, the president of the university, Dr. Meltem Müftüler Baç, the dean of faculty and arts and sciences, and Dr. Gülgün Aydın, professor of psychology at Sabancı, who have all been critical in making this event happen. And we have two very esteemed speakers with us here today, Drs. Amie Gordon and Jeffry Simpson. Amie Gordon will go first, followed by a short Q&A, and then Dr. Simpson's talk will follow. So Dr. Gordon received her PhD from University of California, Berkeley, completed her postdoctoral fellowship at University of California, San Francisco, and moved to the University of Michigan in 2020, where she's currently an assistant professor. Her research focuses on uncovering the social, cognitive, affective, and biological factors that shape our closest relationships, romantic relationships. She is particularly well known for her research on the role of prosocial relationship processes such as perspective taking, gratitude, partner appreciation, on relationship functioning, and how these processes are impacted by both internal and external factors, for example, by lack of sleep, hunger, or work stress. She's the recipient of the Gerald Miller Early Career Award from the International Association for Relationship Research and the Carol Rospel Close Relationships Early Career Award, and was recognized by the Association for Psychological Science as the Rising Star. So today she is going to be sharing her work with us titled A Dyadic Perspective on Stress in Romantic Relationships. So without further ado, I turn the mic over to Amie.
Thank you so much, Oz, for that kind welcome. I just want to make sure you can still see my screen as you should, like the green around it one way. We're good? Okay.
Yes.
And I'll have to say it's always interesting. I think I took a reverse path of a lot of people where I started out studying positive processes, and then as I've gotten further into my career, I've actually started sort of blending in more of what we might think of traditionally as sort of the negative side of relationships. So in a newer line of research that I'm excited to share with you guys today, I'll be talking about taking a dyadic perspective on stress in romantic relationships. So putting this work sort of into the larger context, in 2021, Gallup asked thousands of individuals around the world to report on their stress levels, and 41% of their respondents reported that they'd experienced a lot of stress the prior day. They also have been tracking what they call a negative experience index, so sort of a composite of the negative experiences that people have. And they've been tracking this over time, and we can see over the past 15 years a steady rise in sort of negativity. And this comes from over 100,000 adults in 122 different countries. And even if you just take the past 5 years, we know that stress is very prevalent. The APA is in their annual polls are seeing really high levels of stress, higher than what people sort of report as a healthy level of stress. And so the question that I've had is, what does this mean for our relationships? And what's the role of our relationships in this context of stress? So this is a question that has been asked for a long time. And a lot of this work focuses on sort of the stress buffering hypothesis, or the idea that social support is a means to buffer stress. So the stress buffering hypothesis is sort of this idea that the perceived availability of support helps weaken those negative effects of stress, right? So knowing that you have people there who can help you can act as a buffer. And in that way, our relationships can be very important. And indeed, our romantic relationships tend to act as a primary source of support in adulthood and sort of beginning in adolescence. Now, what I want to point out is that the work that has been done on this, and there's a lot of great work out there on looking at stress and support in the context of romantic relationships, it primarily has focused on a support recipient and a support provider, right? So situations in which one person is undergoing stress and the other person is there to take, is there potentially as someone who can be a support provider. So this has been done in real life, right? So some classic studies looking at situations when one partner is taking a big exam, like in the US, the bar exam to become licensed to be a lawyer, and how the other person, their partner, provides them support, the type of support they provide them. It's also been looked at in the context of chronic illness. So when one partner is experiencing chronic illness and the other partner is there again to provide support or not. This has been looked at in the lab in more controlled settings where they might induce stress through a laboratory stressor for one partner typically, or support conversations are common as well. So perhaps each partner takes a turn talking about a source of stress or a problem in their life, and then the other partner responds to that in this more naturalistic conversation. But again, where you really identify one person as sort of the stressed partner and the other person as the support provider. And so our question has been, what about situations in which both partners are stressed? These create moments in which partners need to both give and receive support sort of in that same moment. And what does this do for a relationship? And there's very little work out there that has directly looked at this, but anecdotally, this seemed to be a common experience. And so I will say that this research is a little bit of me search with my collaborators on this project. So Anna Lewerson and Ezra Ashigil, who I saw your name out there, Ezra, so excited to have you joining us today. So sort of talking about this experience in which it seems rare that one partner is stressed and the other partner has nothing else going on. It's just able to be there providing them with support. Instead, real life seems to be both of you often just trying to get by. And so understanding sort of that unique dyadic experience when both partners are under stress is what we've wanted to do in this line of research. And so our question, broad question, is concurrent stress a pain point for couples? So when both partners are under stress, is this perhaps a particularly difficult time? And so again, this is early in this line of research, but today I'm just going to talk about sort of 3 basic questions we've been asking. So one is it common, right? So do couples even experience this, and how frequently do they experience situations of concurrent stress where both partners are reporting stress? Is it meaningful? So when it does happen, does it shape the quality of relationships differently, perhaps though when both partners are not under stress? And is it distinct? So does it differ from those situations that have been looked at more typically in research, which is where what we're calling non-concurrent stress, or where one partner is stressed and the other partner is more free to be sort of the support provider and not needing support as much themselves. So today, I want to address these questions through 3 studies. So the first 2 are naturalistic studies where we just measure people's self-reported stress and their relationship quality. The first was a 7-day diary that was conducted pre-pandemic. The second is a 12-month longitudinal study that was conducted during the pandemic. And then the third study I'm going to talk about, I don't actually have the results in terms of the relationship quality piece, but this is a laboratory study where we developed a manipulation to try to get at this type of stress in the lab. So I want to tell you sort of about what we did and what we're seeing with that. So in terms of concurrent stress in daily life, this was some of the first analyses we ran to ask this question. So this was actually a larger study that I conducted in the San Francisco Bay Area, a 7-day diary study with 79 cohabiting couples, a larger study, but we did measure stress in this study. And so it seemed like a perfect place to start asking these questions. So we had over 1,000 days of data. And the first question is just, is concurrent stress a common experience? So people reported their stress on a Likert scale, and we took sort of above the midpoint, those higher levels of stress, just in terms of trying to quantify this concurrent stress. And we found that over 96% of couples experience at least one day of what we're calling concurrent stress, in which both partners report sort of moderate to higher levels of stress. And across all of our over 1,000 days, 16% of those days, both partners were reporting higher levels of stress. With nearly half of the days, one partner, but not the other. And then a little over a third of the days, we had both partners reporting low or no levels of stress that day. So again, most of our couples, at least once during that week, experienced a day in which both of them were stressed. And so our question then is that a meaningful experience? So does their relationship look different on days when both partners are stressed compared to days when only one or no partner is stressed? So to get at that, for today, for this talk in the sake of time, I'm going to tell you about two outcomes. So how satisfied they report being that day, and then conflict in their relationship, which to us always seemed like a very important relationship outcome that might be affected by both partners being stressed. So to get at this, I'm going to show you active partner interdependence model analyses in which we modeled both partners and the effect of their stress on their own relationship quality, as well as the effect of their stress on their partner's relationship quality. But because we were interested in the dyadic effect, we also modeled the interaction between the two partners. So the actor by partner interaction, so both of their stress. And so in these analyses, what we found was that on days when both partners independently reported being more stressed, they had lower relationship quality and higher relationship conflict. So relationship satisfaction was measured on a 1 to 100 scale. So these are truncated y-axes, and you'll see I've since moved to trying to show you the full scale. So in my later graphs, but the key here to us, the takeaway was, okay, so on days when both partners are stressed, they do report lower satisfaction, greater conflict than on other days. And in terms of, is it a distinct experience? So on days when only one partner is stressed, they actually don't look that different than days in which neither partner reports levels of higher levels of stress. So in this study, it seems like there's really this sort of unique effect of both partners being stressed, this unique dyadic experience. Now, an important question that we had, and that has been asked when I present this initial data, is, are couples stressed because their relationship is distressed, right? So it may be that our results reflect a different story, that both partners may be more likely to report stress on days when they experience conflict or other problems in their relationship, right? So the story could actually be that their stress is coming from a shared source, and that's their relationship. So I want to note here that our results hold controlling for relationship quality on the prior day, but it could still be tapping into same day effects. And because we didn't design this particular study specifically to examine stress in relationships, we can't separate that out, that it's not that they had a big fight and then at the end of the day, they're both reporting being stressed. So that's something that we do measure more directly in our later studies, which are specifically designed to test these questions. So with that, I want to turn to our second study, which is looking at concurrent stress during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so when Anna and I had started sort of thinking about this topic, we had run these initial studies on this existing data set. We brought Ezra into the project, and we were just planning to launch a second diary study, sort of getting more at these questions of what their stress is and more specifics. This was in spring 2020 when the pandemic hit. And so at first we're like, oh, we'll just wait a few weeks until the pandemic's over. Then we can go ahead and run our study without this weird aberration of stress that everyone's experiencing. And so we waited, and then finally came to terms with the fact that it was not going to be a short-lived experience, much as unfortunately. And so instead we pivoted and launched a study that actually would sort of be specific to looking at stress in this context. And so we collected multiple samples, and the one I'm going to tell you about today was a longitudinal study, first launched at the end of April 2020, and we followed participants through May 2021, though we had a good bit of attrition. These are people who are sheltering in place with their partner broadly in the United States. We ended up with 618 participants, and about half of them come from 151 couples. So we have some individuals, but we have a good number of dyads in this data set as well. So almost 2,500 data points across the longitudinal study from all of these different participants. So I'll take a moment just to sort of set the stage of descriptively what our relationship quality looked like for these participants. So we did ask them at the beginning, at that baseline, about how their relationship had changed. And so interestingly, in this sample, we saw that the majority of people actually reported that their relationship quality had gone up, that they were more satisfied, at least with their relationship. They're more satisfied with the quality of time they're spending with their partner. But we also looked perhaps at the more negative side of the relationship and saw a slightly different story, that there was a good distribution in terms of whether people felt the pandemic was influencing sort of how much conflict they had in the relationship, how irritated they were with their partner, how much their partner was irritated with them. So an interesting time in which we're seeing sort of both an increase in positivity, but also possibly negativity in the relationship as well. And as someone who studies sleep, I just want to also point out was curious about other factors that were changing. And so I bring this up in terms of that there was a good number of people who reported sort of worse sleep as well, because that is related to stress and relationship quality. And so some of these sort of physical health outcomes that we're seeing seem to map onto that. So again, this is just sort of descriptives of people are experiencing a lot going on in their relationships, and an interesting time in which we anticipated sort of that we would see reduced relationship quality, but it's a more nuanced picture than that. So in terms of our actual question of stress, we measured stress in a few different ways. And so one of the ways we did it, because we didn't have both partners for all of our dyads, some we just had individual reports, we just asked them to sort of quantify their experience and categorize it. So that a situation in the past week that neither they or their partner was stressed, one of them was, and whether it was just their partner, just them, or that both of them were. And so from this, self-report data, we can ask across all of our waves of data collection, how common, or perhaps in this context of COVID pandemic, more common is concurrent stress. And so what we do see here is that when people self-report on sort of what they think both they and their partner have been experiencing over the past week, we see that up until May 2021, over half of our participants at each wave are reporting that both they and their partner are stressed. And we see particularly November 2020, which was the presidential election in the US, we see even higher levels of concurrent stress. So it definitely was, at least from the individual's experience, a time in which there was a lot of stress and both partners were under stress frequently. So then turning, what does that mean for their relationships? Is it a meaningful experience? So we assessed in this case at each time point relationship quality in the past week. So in addition to satisfaction and conflict, I also just wanted to show you the results for sort of how satisfied they are with quality time. And that's another piece of the puzzle that we've been thinking about, that especially during the pandemic, couples often had a lot more time with each other. But how does your experience of stress change that time and how satisfied you are with the time that you do get, right? So it may be that you get less time. It may also be that when you get that time, it qualitatively is different if you're both stressed than if you're lower in stress. And so from this categorical variable, looking at this first, what we saw was in terms of whether it's a meaningful experience, that indeed we see that when people report that both they and their partners are more stressed, they are less satisfied and generally have lower relationship quality than if they say neither of us was stressed. We also see that's true when they, across the board, compared to when they say just their partner was stressed and they weren't. And so asking that question of not is it just meaningful, but is it distinct, I want to point out that for conflict, we see that people report greater conflict when they report both of their partners are stressed compared to any other situation. But for satisfaction and quality time, they don't distinguish in this way of measuring it between sort of their own stress and that concurrent stress. So it may be in this case an effect of when I'm stressed, things are worse. And that the partner's stress is less meaningful. But as I mentioned, we also had 151 dyads when we started the study. And so from waves 2 through 6, we also asked them to just report, similar to the first diary study, how stressed, tense, and overwhelmed they felt. So this was a single item, a triad that was amongst a bunch of other sort of states, how are you feeling right now, separated from all of the relationship items. And so from this, we were able to do the same sort of actor-partner interdependence modeling, in which we could look at each partner's report of their own stress and the interaction between them in predicting these relationship quality outcomes. So what we found here in this study was actually two main effects. So both actor stress and partner stress predicted lower relationship quality. So what that means is it's an additive model. So when each partner is stressed, we see sort of worse outcomes, which means that when both partners are stressed, we see the lowest relationship quality across the board. What we don't see is an interaction here. And so we're seeing that either partner being stressed is worse than no stress, and then both partners being stressed is worse than, in terms of these associations, than if one partner is stressed or no partner is stressed. But again, it's interesting, these do sort of map onto those initial dyadic ones, where we do see that when a partner reports that they're stressed, we see differences in relationship quality. Even if in that prior one where we had people just self-report the categories, we didn't see people always distinguishing between partner stress and no stress if they thought their partner was stressed. So this suggests maybe something is interesting in terms of when people are experiencing stress and whether their partner is actually perceiving that stress or not. And so that's something we'll be looking at in the future as well, sort of that important distinction between what I say I feel and what you're picking up on, and how those might differentially affect our relationship. So as I mentioned, a lot of this could be the other direction, right? That when we're experiencing conflict, we're both saying we're stressed, and that's driving our effects. So we did specifically ask them how much of their stress is due to their relationship. And what we actually find is not much. So when we ask people if they report that they're feeling stressed, we then say, well, how much of this is due to your relationship? And most of the time, it's not at all to very little that's the source of their stress. And when we control for this, either by removing cases or any data points where people do report that it was a source, we see similar results. We also, when we control for it by adding no stress as like a 0 on the scale, since this is only measuring when they are experiencing stress, and then we control for that, we generally see that these results hold. So it doesn't seem in this way that the relationship is driving the stress, although I'm sure that it all works together. So sort of summarizing these two naturalistic studies and trying to answer this question of, is concurrent stress a pain point for couples? We see that couples appear to regularly experience concurrent stress, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, which is perhaps not surprising. And they do report lower relationship quality when both partners are experiencing more stress compared to when one or neither partner is lower in stress, particularly when we take a dyadic approach and look at both partners' independent reports of how stressed they are. But again, I think a really important question here is this a causal effect? If we want to be able to make claims about, stress affecting relationships and concurrent stress being this unique experience, it's really important that we are able to sort of tease that apart using experimental methods in which we can actually manipulate stress. Another important question that we have is, what is it about concurrent stress that might be affecting relationship quality? So we've asked people, right, we're getting at things like conflict and quality time, but ultimately we're really interested in what's happening in moments when both partners are stressed compared to other moments. How are partners interacting with each other? What does that, conversation or dynamic look like that might be different? And I think really getting in and seeing that is critical for understanding the importance of this moment. And so with that, as I mentioned, we have developed a laboratory stress manipulation building off of existing ones in order to tackle some of these questions. So we developed this paradigm and piloted it with 40 couples and sort of made some manipulations based on what we saw in that piloting. And then in 2021 and 2022, we actually ran 218 cohabiting couples through a laboratory experiment. Then we followed them up with diary and longitudinal data in order. And the goal, which we haven't analyzed this yet, but the goal is to look at how that laboratory then the results from the lab and how they behave in the lab might map onto how they then report sort of experiencing stress in daily life. So the stress manipulation builds off of the classic Trier social stress test, in which participants have to undergo essentially a job interview and a verbal math task in front of a panel of 2 judges. So we adapted it such that they were informed that they were going to have to do a job interview and verbal math test. The judges came into the room and told them about it. Then they were given 15 minutes to prepare, and they were given note cards, and they were given a job application or a job ad and told, okay, you need to prepare to go do this. We're gonna also look over the notes that you write down to see how prepared you were. And by the way, during this time, you also need to work together as a couple to complete this task, in which they were given these magnetic tiles and a picture of a boat, and they were told to build this boat. They had to work together. They also were given 3 additional tasks, and they were told these just need to get done during this 15 minutes. One of you can do it, both of you can figure out how. The point is just at the end, they all have to be done. And the idea of these latter 2 tasks was to mimic the sort of demands that couples might experience in everyday life, right? So having to do joint decision-making, as well as sort of household chores that might go on that just someone has to get done, right? And something that one partner might pick up more of those when the other partner has something stressful going on. And so we also, through piloting, decided to incentivize them and basically say, if you get all of this done, we know we're asking a lot, so we'll give you an extra $5 at the end if you're able to complete everything correctly. And so, our goal was to really develop something that would mimic what couples might experience in daily life. And so I just want to take a moment to reflect on that external validity. And we're going to do more to sort of link behavior in the lab to daily life. But just as a first pass, in that diary study, we did ask people about the sources of stress in daily life, how much they'd had problems with a variety of different sort of domains. And the top 2 were work and trying to do too much to do in too little time. And then following that was household duties. So in that way, sort of the tasks we're giving them seem to mimic what they're saying they're actually experiencing. I'll also note that here in red is their romantic relationship, which, following what we'd seen before, does not seem to be a major source of their stress. It's there for sure, but is not one of the top sources. We also asked them in the COVID study that we ran about how much their stress was due to feeling sort of overwhelmed and too much to do. And we see some evidence there as well that this seems to be a common source of stress for people. So in terms of the actual manipulation, in the concurrent stress condition, both partners had to prepare for the interview. They were given different jobs so that they couldn't sort of prepare together. They were actually, through piloting, we decided to give them one booklet that had a bunch of different jobs in it. And theirs were on 2 pages where they couldn't, it was a limited resource, and they sort of had to share the booklet with the preparation material in it, and they couldn't look at it easily together at the same time. Sort of, again, trying to mimic that demand of, if I'm working, then you need to be doing something, putting the kids to bed or whatever it is, that often sort of your stress, those sources of stress might be mutually exclusive, that you can't, in many contexts, just go work on it together. So in the non-concurrent stress condition, we had one partner do the job interview preparation, and the other partner did not have to do an interview. And in the control condition, they were only given those additional tasks. And so there was no job interview. Afterwards, they all did go into another room and either do the interview and the verbal math task, or sit quietly and sort of on their own, imagining what it would have been like if they'd done that. So we controlled sort of for that everyone went and had that experience for the same amount of time. So what I do want to show you today is sort of what their stress looked like across the conditions. So this is change. So we measured stress in a number of different ways, self-reported, physiological indicators. So what I want to show you today is their systolic blood pressure, which is pretty reliably shown to react in sort of this stress context. So this is change in systolic blood pressure from baseline. So we sort of equate those beginning individual differences. So everyone starts out at the same point at baseline, and then we're looking at reactivity over the task. So the overload phase between the two lines is that 15 minutes. And then we have the actual interviews or them sitting quietly, and then a recovery that happens after some positive conversations at the end of the lab. So what we see here is that control couples show relatively low levels of stress. And interestingly, even with the sort of manageable amount that we gave them, we do see some elevated blood pressure. Sort of, we stop them mid 15 minutes and say, okay, now you have to take your blood pressure and fill out some questionnaires, sort of unexpectedly. And we do see them react some. The non-concurrent stress, the partner who doesn't have to do the interview, shows some elevation, but much less than the two partners who are doing the interview and the non-concurrent partner who is. So it seems that we, through this task, have been able to effectively manipulate levels of stress as we had hoped we would. And so our next question will just be, how much do we then end up seeing that this maps onto sort of relationship quality outcomes in the lab, as well as picking up on their behaviors. So again, we've coded all of these to see how people are performing during these different situations in order to understand, which couples are perhaps doing better and which are struggling. So that brings me to my future direction. So again, there's a lot. I think of this really as just our first pass in trying to understand this line of work. And so just a couple of important questions. So one question that we're beginning to tackle is, how does concurrent stress affect support processes? And that's part of why we wanted to actually look at couples in the lab and be able to capture how they're helping each other. So again, this idea is that one of the things that's unique is that during concurrent stress, partners both have to give and receive support. So sort of playing dual roles. And so understanding how it affects that is going to be really important. Another question that we have is about distinguishing between types of stress, right? So we focused in the lab on sort of that feeling of too much to do and too little time, sort of external work stress. But there's many different ways that people experience stress. And our early studies were just capturing sort of broadly how stressed they feel, right? But if that stress is coming from something acute versus chronic, if it's coming from something emotional, something versus something more tangible, if it's work versus your child being sick, right? There's meaningfully different ways that we experience stress. And so figuring out whether it's the psychological experience of stress that has similar downstream consequences regardless of what's causing it, it will be important to know if it's that or if it's that different types of stress do, create different outcomes. Perhaps some stress, you can't do anything about it, and being able to support your partner and distract yourself might be useful. At other times, the only way to deal with your stress might be to have time to work through whatever's going on if it's something controllable. And so in that case, maybe what's useful or most helpful in that moment might be different. So I think that's something important that we need to attend to in future research. And finally, a big question we had in the long run is, can concurrent stress actually promote growth in relationships? And so this is a question that we've wondered about. There's work out there on sort of post-stress resiliency and growth. And so it might be that some couples, this is a pain point, and for others, it's an opportunity to come together, to really get closer, to face something hard together and get through it. And so sort of capturing that or illustrating that, we have collected a lot of qualitative data from that study run during the pandemic. And we had, some participants say things like, oddly, I kind of feel like we've been getting along better since this whole pandemic thing started. We've been paying more attention to each other's stress and doing what we can to help each other out. And so this sort of, again, illustrates this idea that for some couples, this might be a moment of growth, and it might actually be a moment that ultimately shapes the relationship quality in a positive way. And so with that end, we have in that first study, that diary study, looked at whether some people might be more resilient to concurrent stress. We looked at a variety of interpersonal and intrapersonal resources. So baseline relationship satisfaction, socioeconomic status. We also looked at gender, given prior work has looked at, found some consistent gender differences in support processes. And we found no consistent evidence of moderation for relationship quality outcomes or for individual outcomes like their negative or positive emotions and their physical health. So we need to look at this in our other studies as well and see if it replicates, but also sort of sending us back to the drawing board of thinking through what it might be that would categorize couples who are able to thrive during these times versus struggle. So if you guys have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. And with that, I'll just say a big thank you again to Anna and Ezra, who are amazing collaborators, to my lab, to Maria Luciani, who really helped get this study going and made sure a lot of this data was collected, and to Oz and Gould for putting this on and inviting me here today, and to UCLA for providing funding for it. And thank you to all of you for taking the time, some of you at very early hours or very late hours of the day. It's wonderful to have such a great turnout. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We have 2 questions.
Yeah.
Or we have now more questions are coming in the Q&A. So one of the questions is about gender roles. What is your opinion about the effect gender roles can have on the relationship between stress and relationship satisfaction and conflict? Not just gender, but gender roles.
Gender roles, right. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish between gender and gender roles. And in our later studies, we've tried to get inclusive samples, but we really have to oversample for same gender couples in many ways to be able to tease those apart. So we have not formally measured people's sort of gender role beliefs or traditional gender roles, but in terms of what we do have of gender, again, we thought we might find differences based on gender. And so there, I feel like there's some conflicting research out there. So sometimes, right, if we think about gender roles, we thought in some ways women traditionally have done more to support the relationship, right? And so it may be that what happens when they're stressed is different. And there is some evidence. So the little of work that has been done on looking at both partners' stress does find differences in terms of when men are stressed versus when women are stressed. And sometimes it seems like women being stressed is more problematic. But we also wondered if they'd be better able to handle it and provide support. So I don't have an answer in terms of because I don't think the literature is necessarily super clear. But I agree that gender is an important consideration, and that because there's sort of different expectations sometimes in terms of support of the relationship, of the family. And that's, again, we have to get at the types of stress. If it's a work stress, the expectations, right, for a man who's traditionally been expected to work outside the home might be different than for women who tend to do more, even when they work outside of the home, of more of sort of the home care. And so what I'll say is I think it's a very interesting piece of the puzzle that needs to be figured out. And I was actually surprised that we didn't find any consistent effects differing by gender in terms of people's self-reported stress. And that might be where we need to go into type of stress. It might be also that we're collecting more contemporary data sets and things are changing in terms of people's expectations of relationships.
There are many new questions coming in, but we're going to run out of time. Yeah. I'm very sorry. So I'm going to just pose one follow-up question that is common to several of the questions. So does the effect of concurrent stress depend on whether the stress is internal to the relationship or external? a little bit answer this because it doesn't seem to be like the shared conflict is making a difference there. But nevertheless, if you have any other thoughts on that, that'd be great. And also, the question is whether, does it matter whether the stress that they're sharing is perhaps external but still shared, like
Yes.
COVID, versus, you know,
Exactly.
one partner has this stress and the other partner has another stress. So you have any
Yeah.
data or thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's something that we've definitely talked a lot about. And specifically in the lab, we were trying to sort of keep it clean with these separate stressors that are external to the relationship, because completely, I think that's sort of my point of, we really have to think about the types of stress. And I gave examples of, you know, emotional versus something more tangible, but it's also going to be true. You know, one of our questions is, what's the difference between when it's shared and when it's separate stress? And, you know, so a question there is, are shared stressors easier as a way for partners to bond together, right? If they can face some shared stressor together. There is a little bit of research that looked at, in a sample of Black Americans, they looked at financial strain and discrimination, and they found that, you know, having a partner experience sort of financial strain was harder on the relationship, but discrimination did not seem to have those same effects. And sort of this idea of what's controllable, what's maybe more relationship, sort of within the relationship, versus some external stressor that might be more shared, that might be very much outside the relationship, might have different effects on relationship quality. So it's definitely an important area to pursue. We started to map it all out. We're like, there is a lot here.
So. A lot. So yeah, you're going to be busy for the next 40 years.
Please, if you have data, let us know. So.
Okay, thank you so much, Amie. There are a couple of a number of questions. If you want to answer them in the Q&A, that'd be great. Otherwise, I am going to turn to our second speaker, Dr. Jeffry Simpson, who has received his PhD from the University of Minnesota, and I didn't know this, but started his academic career at Texas A&M University. In 2004, he returned back to his alma mater, University of Minnesota, as a full professor, and since 2018 has been serving as the chair of the psychology department. I don't know how you were able to survive that long in that role. Dr. Simpson's research investigates close relationships and interpersonal processes from many different theoretical frameworks, but particularly from evolutionary and developmental theories. He's well known for his work on the impact of attachment orientations on relationship functioning across the lifespan. I routinely assign his articles to my undergraduates and graduate students alike. And he's also interested in how the behaviors, values, and beliefs of partners within a dyad might impact each other's physical health outcomes. He's been recognized for his scholarship by numerous awards, too many to count, but among them are the Diener Award for Distinguished Mid-Career Achievement, and his papers in the last couple of years has gotten Best Article Awards from the International Association for Relationship Research and the International Society for Self and Identity. He has also been recognized as a great teacher and mentor. He's gotten the Distinguished University Teaching Professor Award from Minnesota and the Distinguished Mentoring Award from the International Association for Relationship Research in 2018. And today, Dr. Simpson will share with us his work titled Early Life Attachment, Stress, and Caregivers as Predictors of Adult Health. Thank you, Dr. Simpson.
Thank you, Ozlem. And I'm really glad to be here today. And I think a lot of what I will talk about toward the end of my talk will dovetail nicely with what Amie just talked about. So what I'm going to talk about today basically is the results of 5 published studies from the Minnesota Longitudinal Study of Risk and Adaptation, a study that's followed people from actually before they were born until now into middle adulthood. And so it's more of a lifespan perspective, looking at what happens to you earlier in life in terms of your life stress, the quality of care that you get, the pattern of your attachment with your primary caregivers when you're younger. How does that affect your health outcomes when you enter early middle adulthood, moving into middle adulthood? And so I've done this work with a bunch of collaborators with the Minnesota Project, and I want to also acknowledge them. This work was started before I was even in college, and so it's been a team effort by a lot of different people. So the goal of the talk is quite simple. I want to address the question: are certain interpersonal events experienced early in life prospectively related to adult health outcomes many years later? And to do analyses that kind of pin the effects to what happened to you earlier in life, controlling for what's happening to you in, let's say, early middle adulthood. So the basic theoretical model that's kind of guided our work was proposed by Greg Miller and Edith Chen back in 2013. And you can refer to it as a social developmental model of health. We don't test everything that's in this model. We don't have good measures of genetic liability, for example. Our sample is too small to do those analyses. But we do have a lot of measures that are in this model that are informative, and we have them at multiple points across the lifespan. So according to this model, childhood socioeconomic disadvantage, growing up without financial resources or in a difficult rough and tumble environment, what it does is it exposes children at a young age to greater family instability, less nurturance, poor quality of care from parents, exposure to more conflict and potentially violence in either the family, the nuclear family, or the neighborhood, poor nutrition, and exposure to toxins, things like lead paint or pollution in the environment. And according to this social developmental model, these exposure to these kinds of things, especially early in life in the first 5 to 10 years, has a programming effect on our immune system. It produces what's called a pro-inflammatory phenotype, in which the body kind of is hyper-reactive to pathogens, to things that are coming at it. And so what you get within individuals is an aggressive microbial response, where when pathogens are induced, the inflammation system of the body overreacts basically, and you get resistance to inhibitory signals, and you get mild or sometimes more than mild inflammation in the body. And inflammation does cell damage. It basically damages cells and ages us more rapidly than our biological age would indicate. So you've got these programming effects early on if you're exposed to these kinds of environmental things, many of which are interpersonal. But as children develop and they, let's say, enter middle childhood and adolescence, there are stable behavioral proclivities that go along with this. So if you're raised in an unstable, low nurturance, more hostile environment, you become more aware of threats in the environment, and you become more vigilant to threats. You experience more social difficulties, interpersonal difficulties with friends and other people in your environment. You seek immediate rewards as opposed to delayed gratification. You have a more difficult time controlling and regulating your behavior. And you oftentimes engage in unhealthy lifestyle. You eat more poorly, you don't sleep quite as well. And so all of these behavioral proclivities are what they term accentuating effects that also feed into this pro-inflammatory phenotype. So basically what happens is the body is programmed by the early environment, at least somewhat programmed by the early environment. And once it's programmed, it can change, but the first 5 to 10 years of life are critical for getting the body programmed and can lead to later health problems, especially if there's no change later on in the person's environment. Okay. So the Minnesota study started in 1975, 1976, when firstborn mothers who were below the poverty line in Minneapolis were recruited into the study. And we've been following 170 of these mothers and their firstborn children from the mid-1970s through now, basically. So the children, the targets, the participants in our study are now about 47, 48 years old, and we are still studying them, doing brain imaging work on them right now. So we have collected a lot of different measures at multiple points in time from before they were born in 75 or 76 to now. But I want to focus on just these key measures today because they're most relevant to what I want to be talking about. So we have good measures of their the children's who become adults in now. Their attachment, we have strange situation scores on them when they were 12 and 18 months. I'll describe that in a moment. We have the adult attachment interview on them when they were age 19 and 26. We have good measures of how much stress they experienced across their lives, rated from interviews that their mother completed when they were children and they completed from early adolescence onward. We have good measures of the quality of caregiving they got from videotapes of their mothers supporting them in stressful situations at different points of development. And we also have reasonably good measures of their health assessed at age 32 and 37, and now we're continuing that as they're entering the middle 40s. We have measures of the self-reported quality of their health compared to their peers, the number of diagnosed health problems they have, and also their cardiometabolic functioning, which is simply an aggregate measure of their BMI, their waist-to-hip ratio, their blood pressure, and their C-reactive protein scores, which is a measure in the blood of inflammation. So let me step back and talk a little bit about these measures a little more because they're really critical to understanding the studies I'll be talking about. So the strange situation is about a 20-minute stressful event where children are separated from and then reunited with their primary caregiver. In this case, in our study, it was their mother or their mother figure. And what's coded for in the strange situation is mainly the reunion behavior. What happens when the child's alone and then the mother comes back, or the child's in the room with the stranger and their mother comes back into the room. And what you see in this strange situation is that children who have a secure relationship with their mothers, they're upset when the mother comes back initially, but the mother is able to soothe them, they calm down, and they resume play or exploration in the room. And about 60 or 65% of children, typically, at least in our culture, are securely attached. Insecure kids, when their mother comes back, they don't calm down. They either act angry and protest, or they kind of move away from her and act as if they're not bothered, but their cardio output is elevated. Their heart rate is elevated. They may look calm on the outside, but on the inside, they're not. And about a third of children are one of these two types of insecure kids. Our life stress measures were collected at multiple points in time where participants, either the mothers early on or the children later on, were given an interview and asked about the degree to which 40 different events were disruptive to their life during the past 6 months and the degree to which they were disruptive. And so it was an interview that was encoded by experts who were trained in life stress. And the caregiving measures were, again, videotapes of the children and their mothers when the child was asked to do tasks that were above their age ability, tasks that were beyond what they could reasonably do. And the focus was on how does the mother or the primary caregiver in the videotaped event, how do they handle it? How do they scaffold the child so the child can have the most successful outcome possible in a constructive way? So I'll talk about 5 studies today, real briefly, that kind of tap or assess and involve some of these measures. So the first question that we had early on back in 2013 in a paper led by Jennifer Puig was, does being securely attached early in life in the strange situation predict general health outcomes, better health outcomes in adulthood? The idea would be that if you have a secure relationship with your primary caregiver, if they're good at being able to support you, especially when you're young and vulnerable, does that translate into you being able to have better health later on in life? And what we found in this first study, which appeared in Health Psychology, is that participants who were insecure as children 30 years earlier reported more health problems at age 32. Correlation there is negative 24. So you can see it's not a large correlation, but that's a 30-year gap between the strange situation and when their health was assessed. And of equal importance, what we find is that, because we want to pin the effect back to what happened earlier on, as opposed to what's happening concurrently, these effects, or this effect, held when several potential confounds were controlled. So the correlation remained significant when we controlled for their gender, their SES at age 32, their body weight at age 32, their neuroticism at 32, the amount of life stress they were experiencing at age 32, and also the perceived level of support they had in their environment. So there's something about having a secure relationship earlier on that kind of remains with you and has at least some association with your health 3 decades later. Okay, so one of the primary correlates of attachment security is the quality of care you get in the home. And we have good measures of the quality of care that they receive from their primary caregiver, their primary attachment figure, across development, beginning at about age 6 months and going through about age 13. So our next question, which appeared in the journal Psychological Science with Lee Raby being the lead author, our next question was, how is the quality of early care that we see from videotapes, rated from videotapes, related to physiological reactivity, skin conductance levels, during interpersonal conflicts in adulthood? So in this study, we brought participants in the Minnesota longitudinal study in the lab with their partners. We measured, before they did anything, their skin conductance levels. Skin conductance is a measure of sweating, basically, how anxious you feel in a given situation. And then we had them try to resolve the biggest problem they had with their partner in a 10-minute discussion. And then we measured their skin conductance during the discussion. So for each participant in our study, we had their baseline skin conductance, and then their skin conductance at the end of this 10-minute conversation, where they and their partner were trying to deal with and resolve the biggest problem in their relationship. And what we found is that participants who received poorer care earlier in life, between about age 6 months and age 13, aggregated across time, had higher skin conductance levels relative to their baseline levels when discussing this major relationship conflict. And the correlation was 33. It was a fairly large correlation, given again that you're looking at things that are happening many, many, many years apart. And again, these effects then held when we controlled for potential confounds. So when we controlled for the quality of the discussion, the quality of the relationship, the participant's gender, their ethnicity, their childhood SES, we still find that there is a relationship between the quality of care that they got earlier in life and how anxious they appear to be physiologically while trying to resolve a major conflict with their current romantic partner. We then moved on to thinking about what might mediate the link between the quality of early care that they got and their cardiometabolic outcomes at age 32 and later. So the question then was, what mediates the relation between the quality of care and cardiometabolic outcomes? And this study was led by Ali Farrell. And what we found is that, as you would expect, early care is negatively correlated with cardiometabolic outcome. In other words, if you received better care earlier in life, you had better health outcomes at age 32. But the effect was mediated by attachment security on the AAI. And again, the AAI is a 45 to 1 hour long interview that asks people about representations of their childhood. What was it like to be parented by their parents? What did their parents do when they were ill or distressed or afraid? And how do they kind of think about their relationship with their parents now that they become adults? And it's scored basically for what's called coherence of mind, which is the degree to which people have more of a secure representation, higher coherence in adulthood, or more of a less coherent or insecure reflection or representation of their childhood. And what we found in this study is that earlier care, the better quality early care predicted a more secure attachment relationship representation at age 19 and 26. And that in turn predicted better health outcomes at age 32 in terms of cardiometabolic responses. And there was an indirect significant effect from early care quality to AI security to the cardiometabolic outcome, in addition to the main effect from early care to the cardiometabolic outcome. So some of the effect of early caregiving is funneled through, in other words, the way you think about your childhood in early adulthood, age 19 and age 26, which then is linked to your health outcomes at age 32. We then stepped back and thought, well, this kind of relates more to what Amie talked about a little bit. What about life stress? Because we have in this study really good measures of how much stress, how disruptive stressors were at different points of development. And so we asked two questions. The first one was, when during life is stress most predictive of adult health outcomes? Is it early in childhood? Is it in adolescence? Is it later? Is it middle childhood? And second, does receiving better care reduce the negative effects that life stress has on adult health outcomes? In other words, if you have a good relationship with your caregiver early in life, does that relationship buffer you from life stress as it translates to health outcomes many years downstream? So again, in our study, we have a lot of measures of caregiving, especially in the first 13 years of life. And then we have multiple measures of life stress. The same interview given to mothers in the first 15 years, and then the same interview given once our participants reach consenting age from about age 16 onward. And again, we measure health outcomes at age 32, overall health, which is a self-report measure, BMI, and the total number of problems, diagnosed problems that they have diagnosed by medical health professionals. So we were able to, in other words, look at life stress at different developmental periods: early in childhood, basically the first 5 years of life; middle childhood, mainly elementary school years from about age 6 to about age 13; in adolescence from age 16 to about age 19, and then in young adulthood, starting at age 23 and going through age 28. So what do we find? Well, we found that stress is not good. No surprise here. Early childhood stress and adolescent stress and current stress all uniquely predict worse health outcomes. And that's no real surprise. But what's a bit more interesting is some of the interactions that we found. And I will first want to talk about some two-way interactions we found between the degree of stress in early childhood in the first 5 years of life and the amount of stress in adolescence, the time between about age 15 or 16 and age 19. So what you see here are two graphs. The first one on the left shows BMI, body mass index, and the one on the right shows overall self-reported health ratings. So looking first on the left at BMI, you can see there on the y-axis BMI scores. And keep in mind that a BMI score of above 30 is where you begin to enter the morbidly obese range. So BMIs that are lower tend to be better, at least as long as they're not, too low. And what you find here with BMI, as you might expect, is that if a participant in our study experienced high stress in early childhood and high stress in adolescence, they were the heaviest in the sample. Their BMI was entering the range of being morbidly obese. And their health ratings were also the worst. Their self-reported health ratings. So if you look at the right side on the y-axis, this scale can range from 1, which is poor health compared to my peers, to 5, which is excellent health compared to my peers. And so you can see that a score below 3 is definitely below average. And that's where the participants who had high early childhood stress and high adolescent stress fell. And this is actually indicative of the fact that stress at these 2 points in time, early in life and adolescence, may be kind of unique in terms of affecting people's health downstream. We also found an interesting, significant three-way interaction that needs to be replicated, but it is fairly interesting, and it shows an important maternal buffering effect that I want to highlight. So if you look on the left-hand side, what you see there is low adolescent stress, and the right-hand side is those who had high adolescent stress. And if you look at the bottom of each graph, you have low versus high childhood stress on both sides. On the y-axis, the problems are the number of problems of diagnosed medical issues that the participant had, diagnosed by a medical professional, a physician, for example. And so 0 means that they never have had a diagnosed medical problem, and higher numbers approaching 1 would be that they've had at least 1. So you can see in our sample here, at age 32, which is a fairly young age to have medical problems, most people have at least 0.5 on average of a medical problem. And that would be things like, diabetes, a heart condition, a fairly bronchitis, a fairly serious chronic issue. So what you see here, first of what I want to highlight is on the right-hand side, for those participants who had high early childhood stress and high adolescent stress, and they had low maternal support rated from the videos that we collected earlier in life, they reported the highest number of problems. On the other hand, those who had low stress during adolescence and childhood and had more maternal support, they reported very low scores on the chronic health problems. What I want to highlight, though, is down here on the right-hand side. Here's what you have. Here's what I would call a maternal buffering effect. So participants in our study who had high childhood stress early in life and had high adolescent stress, but had good maternal care, had as few problems as almost anyone in our sample. And this just goes to show the importance of that early relationship with the mother. This is actually very good news because it's difficult to reduce the amount of stress that disadvantaged people have, but it's easier to train people to give good care to their kids. It's more cost effective as well. And it looks as if in our study, if you have good care early in life from your mother, that may actually completely buffer or largely buffer the negative impact of stress on your health later in life. Another thing that we looked at, because we had the data, was abuse and neglect. Our sample was a fairly rough and tumble sample. It was born below the poverty line, and about approximately 50% of our sample had some diagnosed or discernible type of abuse or neglect at some point during development, at some point between the time they were born and about age 15 or 16. So the question that we then asked was, does abuse or neglect in childhood also predict adult health outcomes? And the way we measured this is we had a lot of information from all kinds of people, mothers, fathers on occasion, school teachers, participants themselves, child protective services across development that allowed us to determine fairly accurately whether or not each participant had ever been exposed to either sexual abuse or physical abuse or some kind of cognitive, physical, or emotional neglect between the ages of when they were born, 0, and about 17 and a half years of age. And so we simply coded for the occurrence. 1, if they had some kind of abuse or neglect, and 0 if they had not. And then, of course, we had at age 37, we had self-reported health quality measures. We had measures of the number of health problems, and we also had a marker of blood inflammation that was put into this cardiometabolic functioning measure. And again, the cardiometabolic functioning measure was their body weight, their BMI, the waist-to-hip ratio, the size of their waist compared to their hips, their blood pressure taken at multiple points in time, and blood inflammation measured by CRP, C-reactive protein. And what we found basically is that only neglect prospectively predicted the health outcomes that we had at age 37, and they predicted all three of them. And the neglect effects held when we controlled for a bunch of things. Sexual abuse, did it ever happen, yes or no? Physical abuse, gender, ethnicity, maternal SES and education, and even some of their current health reported behaviors. How well were they eating at age 37? How much were they exercising? How well were they sleeping, etc.? And the reason we think neglect is a predictor is because neglect is more of a chronic thing, and it happens over a long period of time, and that time may be needed to begin to have negative effects on a person's health, whereas maybe one or a small number of instances of either sexual or physical abuse might not be enough to begin to affect a person's health, although we need to replicate this in larger samples for sure. So in summary, what we found with this study thus far is that both the quality of caregiving and the amount of stress experienced early in life uniquely predict adult health outcomes. And we've done this by trying to pinpoint effects to what happened earlier on, adjusting for things that are known to predict health concurrently when our health measures were taken at age 32 or at age 37. And also there, again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, there are cost-effective ways to intervene by improving the quality of care children receive in adulthood. And in fact, there are interventions that are now being developed, some of them based upon attachment theory, that teach at-risk parents who are at risk for giving less sensitive care, better ways to scaffold and support their child. Because we think that this may be one of the best and most direct paths to protect kids who are exposed to stressful environments from experiencing deleterious outcomes later in life. Again, these results are from a sample that's not real large, although the measures are quite good. So more needs to be done to replicate these effects. But we think this provides at least preliminary evidence for the importance of what happens to people early in life, both in deleterious ways, but also in protective or buffering ways. So in closing, I want to thank our primary sponsors over the years, the National Institute of Aging and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And this is a list of the papers that I've talked about. You can see the various places where they were published in the DOIs. And I want to thank you for inviting me to talk this morning.
Thank you, Jeff. We have quite a few questions in Q&A. And one of them is whether you have observed any buffering effect of current relationship quality on the link between early care experiences and adult health outcomes.
That's an excellent question. And we don't know. We don't know because most of our assessments with the partners were when they were younger, at age 20, 28, 32. We don't have measures with their current partner when the health measures were taken, sufficient numbers at age 32 and age 37. My hunch would be, yes, my hunch would be that probably the quality of the relationship with the current partner is another potential buffering variable, much like maternal sensitivity would be, but we just can't address it given the nature of the data that we have in the sample. But that's a very, very good question.
Yeah. Another question is whether, BMI is a funny thing. Some people gain weight under stress, some people lose weight under stress. So the question is, can early stress also be associated with the, I guess, extremely low levels of BMI and maybe eating disorders through those kinds of mechanisms? Do you have any data on that?
We actually do. There are a few people of our 170 who are below weight, but they're very few. It's like less than 10%. So in this study, the vast majority of the sample is overweight. But that doesn't mean everyone obviously is. And I should mention that cardiometabolic measure of BMI and waist-hip ratio and number of health problems and C-reactive protein, those measures correlated between about 25 and about 35. And so each of them are kind of semi-independent markers of health problems. We chose to aggregate them because we wanted to be consistent with the literature and to drive a broader measure of cardiometabolic, health. But there were some differences in terms of the effects tied to each of the four measures. So BMI usually was a significant health problem predicted by earlier life events, but it wasn't always for everybody.
Yeah, I understand. I guess there isn't enough variability at the lower end to
Exactly.
Really, yeah. So another question is whether you can tease apart the individual's work employment experiences in their adult lives from their, I guess, early life experiences as they impact their current health. I know you controlled for a number of concurrent conditions like SES, etc. But I think the question here is about work and career experiences.
Very, very good question. And we do have an interview that focuses more on work-life balance at age 32 that some of our students are working with. What I can say is I do know that the satisfaction with work and the stability of holding jobs is associated with the quality of early maternal care and also with life stress. So if you've experienced more stress in your life, you're a little bit more likely to move from job to job and report lower satisfaction with your job. We are still, though, looking at work-life balance. One of the things that I'm very interested in is what predicts the feeling that at early middle adulthood, around age 32 or so and beyond, that you feel like you have a good balance between your personal life and your professional life. And we're beginning to look at that right now. But there's no question that that's a really important variable to consider when you're looking at health outcomes. And we just have not looked at it in a great amount of detail thus far.
Okay. Okay, so another question is, although not as high as low maternal care and high stress in early life, the health problems were also high in low stress and high maternal care conditions. Can this mean helicopter parenting can be a source of stress?
That's a really insightful question. Yeah, potentially. The one thing that's unfortunate is that we don't have much information on the original birth mothers and their children and how their relationship was beyond about age 13. We did interview the mothers about the quality of their relationship with their child when their child was around 37 or 38. But that was just the mother's report and it wasn't an observation. So we don't know exactly what went on between the birth mother and the participant beyond about age 13. At least we have no video evidence of it. I do think that the person who's asking the question is right. There probably is maybe some. I'm not sure if helicopter parenting would be the best way to phrase it, but maybe over involvement in the relationship that could predict downstream negative health outcomes for their child. I just don't know how. I don't know how to address the question.
Yeah. Were there any participants that were insecurely attached as babies but securely attached as adults? And yes. How does that play into the results?
Very good question. There were some people who were insecure in the strange situation, but were coded as secure on the AAI at age 19 and 26. And we refer to those in the literature as earned secure people. It's like there was some kind of resolution that they achieved to kind of forgive their parent and move on and kind of set aside the negativity and the distress of what happened to them earlier in life. Those people tend to fare a little bit better, but they don't fare as well typically as people who were secure in the strange situation and were also secure in the AAI. Those kind of mainstream secure people tend to have the best outcomes of all the possible groups. It's not that resolving it and earning security is a bad thing. It's just that there's still some lingering effects of the early insecurity that is still evident in the behavior of the people who have become secure on the AAI later in life.
Yeah, so I'm going to have my own question actually as a follow-up. So in one of your papers, you show that the early attachment security predicts later health outcomes through adult attachment security on the AAI.
Right.
But that still feels like a very distal mechanism to me. So what is it about the adult attachment security that is kind of like predicting health outcomes in your view?
That's a really good question. And we don't know exactly, but we think part of it may be securely attached people have a more positive and coherent view of who they are as people. And we think they may take better care of themselves. We think that they might, eat better, sleep better. So we think that there are probably some behavioral things that they're doing that allow them to maintain their health. Insecure people oftentimes have low self-worth. Not all of them, but many of them. And one of the things that self-worth is correlated with is not taking care of yourself, even at a young age. And so we think the operative mechanism might be more behavioral things that are linked more directly to health. That's a very good question.
Yeah, okay. So we're almost running out of time. So I'm going to pose one last question, and that is whether you think interventions at school with teachers, with primary elementary school teachers, when the kids are relatively young, be effective. Have you done any work on that kind of
We've begun to do work on that because we've got some good data with their elementary school teachers in first, second, third, and sixth grade, where their teachers reported on the quality of the relationship they had with the participant who was in their classroom. And the answer is yes. I think that could be a corrective relationship. So if you're insecure with your primary caregivers at home, elementary school teachers can be at a kind of a surrogate attachment figure. And if there is a close, warm relationship there, where the teacher is providing the child with scaffolding when they're distressed, that allows them to alleviate their distress, yes, that can be probably a corrective relationship, because the teachers are with them, for an entire year, typically in the classroom, and usually they spend a lot of time together. So that would be another point of intervention. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. This has been such a treat for all of us. And Amie had to leave a little bit earlier because of a family obligation. But I thank both our speakers, and I thank the audience for participating. And Gül, thank you so much for being instrumental in making this happen again. And I wish everybody a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.